Hello, Jeando.
Hi, Kevin.
So in the last conversation, we talked about what happens during a lesson of conscious guidance and control, what someone can expect to learn, and what the purpose of a lesson is. And in that, you mentioned that it's important to lengthen the torso. So why is it important to lengthen the torso, and how do we know if we're doing this correctly?
Okay. Um, Lengthening the torso is a concept that was developed by Alexander. And before saying why it is important to lengthen the torso, it's better to define what it is we mean by torso and what it is we mean by lengthening the torso. Otherwise, I may explain things and people will, in fact, confuse my explanation with something they already know from different practices that they have. Okay, so the definition of the torso by Alexander is quite simple. First of all, he says that it's an oblong bag made of elastic material that is, in fact, constructed with two internal cavities. One is the pelvic cavity, or what we call the abdominal cavity, and the other one is the thoracic cavity. We know well that these cavities are made of bones. Well, one, for example, the pelvic is like a strict, rigid structure, while the thoracic cavity is an articulated structure. We know that the two cavities are, of course, joined by a very long articulation, a joint we call the spine. And this spine with the ribs constitutes an articulated cage that you can, of course, modify the shape. As well, you can, what we say, shorten the torso, which means that we can arch the back between the two cavities in two different directions. You can direct the middle of the torso forward while the two other parts are going back. In that case, you're shortening the torso by having a convex curve, meaning that the central part is going forward and the two other parts are going back. And the opposite is also possible. That is, you can have the middle torso going back and the two other parts of the torso, the extremities going forward, which means that you are slumping. It's a concave shape. So now, why is it problematic to have a habit to shorten the torso, to make a concave or a convex shape, and not what I call last time the middle way, which is the noble pose, which is the fact that to expand the torso, you have to organize the movement of the three different parts. It's what we call the harmonic expansion of the torso, according to Delsart. And when you do not know how to organize the movements of the different parts, when you, well, trust to feeling, to what you feel as good for you in order to sit, to stand, or to walk, for example, any activity of daily life, what is happening is that you are, in fact, compressing the elastic bag I was describing. And this compression has various side effects that are not appropriate, because you have to understand that inside the cavities, of course, there are organs, and these organs function with movements. If you start to impair, to restrict the movements of the parts, you will find that in the long run, of course, there is no danger to shorten the torso here or there. The danger is to continue shortening the torso as a habit. And we will find that many people, without knowing it, are effectively, when they trust to feeling, shortening the torso in their daily activities. I mean, hour after hour, days after days. They are doing that. And of course, there is a first problem with shortening the torso. It's when we talk about function, it's the problem of breathing. Alexander very often talks about rigid rib cages. And most people don't connect that with the fact that when you shorten the torso, either way, well, you tend to rigidify the chest. So there is no point giving breathing exercise to people if they don't know the middle way, if they don't know how to organize the expansion of the torso, because the expansion of the torso is primary to breathing. So many people, many of my students have musical careers, and they use breath in either to play into an instrument or either to speak or, of course, to sing. And well, the first thing is not to teach them breathing as such. The first thing is to teach them how not to shorten the torso. And so that is one. The second is even more common. The second is that when you shorten the torso is the piece of the organism that has the greatest mass, or if you want, the weight. The part of the organism that is the most weight is the torso. So weight enters into equilibrium. And so if you do not know how to lengthen the torso, then you are, as Alexander used the word, misusing the weight or misusing the movement of the torso in your equilibrium system. If you know how to lengthen the torso, well, it makes it much easier to keep your equilibrium. And I'm not so only talking about like physical feat or like people that understand that, for example, in running, it's much better if you know how to organize your equilibrium. But equilibrium enters into any complex, detailed movement, for example, with the hands. I work with people that are, well, for example, dentists or surgeons or artists. They need a very accurate movement with the fingers and the different articulation of the hand and, of course, the arm, the elbow. And very, very often, if there are problems in the extremities like this, in these jobs where people are using these extremities all the time in very minute and, well, they try to be as perfect as they can in their movements, well, you will find that equilibrium of the torso is fundamental to the proper functioning of the different joints of the arm. And the reason is simple, is if you want to stabilize the movement of the fingers, you have to understand that the fingers are attached to the arm and the arm is attached to the torso. So if you don't know how to sit with a lengthening torso, well, without knowing it, you are endangering in the long term your capacity of accurate movement with the extremities. So yes, the torso is central in conscious guidance and control lessons. It's what we want the person to, first of all, recognize. And I think it's better if I go back into what we've said before and give an illustration so that it's more, it's always difficult to realize what it is exactly what Alexander means when he writes something in his books. I found this as I translated the books into another language than English. I found that very often we take for granted that we understand what he says. In fact, we do not. When we go in depth, it's clear that very often what he says does not enter our categories directly. There is a need of a translation. Even I know the books are written in English, but what I do nowadays is very often I translate this book from English to English, so that people can start to, well, at first to have another view on the text, so that, because there is this this way of reading when people just read like it was a book from to take with oneself in the train, for example. You cannot read Alexander in that way. It's not, well, I don't think it's possible to read it every single day like this. Makes no sense. It does start to make sense when you start to really think of the books as a way to construct a procedure, practical procedure. If you are reading something, you should be able to construct a procedure to check whether what is said is can be correct or not, and if also what you think the person is saying is what you is what he's saying really, and if that is in fact consistent with other things he's saying. So, to cut things short, last time I said that I was basing the work on a sentence that is explaining the method of conscious guidance and control. Alexander, so maybe it's better if I go back to the sentence itself. So here it is. So the method is based firstly on the understanding of the coordinated uses of the muscular mechanisms. And secondly, on the complete acceptance of the hypothesis that each and every movement can be consciously directed and controlled. So I want to take the two parts of that sentence and see what it is we can understand out of that. So I already said that there is a problem. The first problem to be solved is the problem of what we call muscular mechanism. Most people have this idea that Alexander is talking about controlling the muscles, of consciously controlling the muscles. Many times I see people commenting and saying that this is insane, that this is impossible, and they're absolutely correct. It's impossible, Alexander say, unthinkable to think of well, specific control of muscles. You cannot control specific muscles. There are more than 700 muscles in the body, and well, many of them are in the torso or originating in the torso, apart from the small ones. And so, yes, this is absolutely correct. So when Alexander is talking about the understanding of the coordinated uses of the muscular mechanism, it's absolutely certain, unthinkable, that he's talking about learning to release a muscle or to contract the right muscle and stop to contract the other muscles. So that is absolutely clear. It's not what we are talking about. When we are talking about mechanism, I always have to point out that a mechanism is not a muscle. A mechanism is a system of parts that have to move in order to produce a function. So when we understand that, we start to have an idea that there is something hidden beneath that text. And we have to start and inquire into what it is we are talking about. So when I invite somebody to have a lesson, the idea behind this lesson is, in fact, described by Alexander with 3 different stages or 3 different levels. So we will find that in their way of using the torso in their normal activity, they tend by habit to, of course, narrow and arch the back. That is what Alexander found, that most people have no conception about expanding the torso in their habitual activity. And the first thing that will come into the first level is what we call the level of re-education. So it's very important that we understand what we mean by reeducation. Reeducation here is the reeducation of what we call subconscious guidance. The movements of the different parts of the torso are guided by the person coming to have a lesson, are guided by what we call sensory appreciation. It's a mental activity. People are doing what they feel is right in order to, in fact, perform their activities. And Alexander said that this has to be this mental belief that feelings is going to help produce movements or is going to help to improve faulty coordinations of movements. He says that this is not correct. He says it's impossible to, in fact, improve by using the same system that has created the problem. If the problem of this absence of lengthening or this shortening of the torso is the fact that people are basing all their gestures on feeling, says it's absolutely unreasonable to try and use the feeling, and I mean the feeling of that person, to improve that coordination. So that's the first thing, the reeducation as a sensory appreciation. And this is not a reeducation of feelings. We are not, in fact, changing one bad feeling or one feeling that is not associated with the correct gesture with one other feeling that should be associated with a new correct gesture. Because that would mean that, in fact, we are using the same feeling in order for the person to pass from wrong to right, which makes, for Alexander, no sense. He repeats that all the time. So we have to first convince our pupil that reeducation is necessary. And in order to convince the pupil that reeducation is necessary, reeducation of the sensory appreciation, we need to produce something. We need to convince the person that yes, the person is using feeling in order to produce certain movements of the different parts of the torso, which lead to a shortening in the torso. The person is not going to believe us straight away because we are saying so. So it's necessary to enter another level, and it's the level of the coordinations of the movements. It's necessary for me to prove to other people, and these people have to maybe what we call lay people, people that know nothing of the Alexander technique, but I have got the same task when I suddenly accept to give a lesson to a modern Alexander teacher, because modern Alexander teachers do not follow this system of teaching. They follow a system of teaching that is somatic, where they have this idea that if they convey with their hands a new organization, the person that is going to feel that new organization is going to be shortly able to produce the expansion at will. So it's necessary in that case to show, in fact, the teacher that, well, after working for 15, 20, 25 years with this system, still we see and we can objectively realize that no reeducation of the sensory appreciation has gone on, has been produced by their system, and that the coordination of the movements of the different parts in habitual activity is still incorrect, and the torso is still shortened. So then, when these two steps are established, then it's possible to enter into a last level, and the last level is the level of readjustment. And that is, we start with an activity where the torso is objectively shorten, and we have to discuss how is it that the person is going to be able to widen the back and find a more normal and extended, what Alexander called, position of the spine. So this, in fact, is just talk. It's absolutely necessary to go into more details, and here we have the first idea that is behind conscious guidance and control, is that there is what we call the means whereby principle, which is a very complex subject. I will go in depth onto that. But for the moment, I just want to take the surface of that principle. And the surface of the principle is that the performance of any act, so I will show you an act that is involving the whole self. So you will find that when an act involves the whole self, there are movements involved. But Alexander is not talking about the movements involved. He's talking about the activity of the person that is making the movement. And he's saying that the performance of any act involves the direction, and that is a mental thing, yes, and performance of a connected series of preliminary acts by means of the mechanism of the organism. So what we have here is a very strange sentence. What do we mean by that? And where is sensory appreciation involved in this? Well, sensory appreciation is involved in the direction of the connected series of preliminary acts. So now I found that there was a way to help people enter that level very quickly. And to enter that level very quickly, Alexander has given us the principle of a procedure of control. The first thing people need to have is to control what it is we are talking about in a very concrete way. Because you want to convince somebody that the sense of feeling is misleading when he's carrying a gesture. Yes. And so you can talk for hours and people will say, well, I don't think so. Say that's your idea, but for me, no, my sensory appreciation is correct. So then Alexander points to a solution, and that's the solution that I call the solution of a procedure of conscious control. And the procedure of conscious control is very simple, is to provide an ocular demonstration. So when I organize a workshop, for example, I have to very quickly bring the people, so especially if they are Alexander teachers of the modern Alexander technique, and bring them to understand what it is we are talking about. So I will start with a very basic activity. I'm showing you a new image. That image was taken during a workshop. There was something like 20 modern Alexander teachers taking part, and they were some of them were senior, more than 20 years of Alexander technique, of teaching the Alexander technique, and some were just newly qualified. Yes, and so I asked them just to walk with ease, walk with all their knowledge of the somatic practice, and say, you are going to give yourself all the orders you think necessary in order to walk. And I just took a film so that I could stop the frames that I wanted to see. So the frame I was interested in was the frame when they were setting foot on the floor. So it was very simple. They just had to walk 5 meters with ease, and I would stop, freeze the screen at the moment where they were placing the feet on the floor. Well, the idea here is that this idea of lengthening the torso, of expanding the torso, as a translation in the Alexander technique, we call the position of mechanical advantage in standing And Alexander even goes further than that. He's talking about the position of mechanical advantage in walking. So in order to know the position of mechanical advantage in walking, you have to, in fact, understand what is happening when a person is performing the activity of walking. And at the moment where the person is starting to support the whole torso with the leg, well, you freeze the screen. And this is not enough. Alexander, in fact, is not only asking us to watch this, but he's also using words. Words in order to describe what it is we see. Because when you see a picture like this, well, I don't know what people will say to themselves, but I know what Alexander would say. I know because Alexander has written about it. So I'm going to change the image. That is not the one I wanted. Sorry, you'll have to cut that. It's gone. Okay, sorry about this. This is the image I wanted to show. So we are watching a picture, yes, and we don't really know what it is, the matter in this picture. It's even not so easy to see that the torso is shortened. So let's see what Alexander has to see. He said that in the walking position, well, we are discussing the wrong use of the mechanism of the torso, of course. In the walking position, the hips were held too far forward, the knee joints were pressed too far back, and the angle of the torso from the hips was armfully inclined backward, with a general tendency, as we say, to narrow the back. Well, as we say to narrow and shorten the back. So let's first go back to that picture. What it is we see that in fact the teacher is placing the foot on the floor according to what she feels correct. What feels at ease is placing the foot there. And we find that there is an angle between the torso and the hip. The whole torso is behind the point of contact with the floor. In physics, this means that the person is, in fact, falling backward. We are not seeing the person fall backward, of course, because there is, first of all, the momentum of the movement, and also there are all the muscular activities of the mechanism that, in fact, are used also not only for walking, but for preventing the backward fall. Yes? So you have to understand that when you see a picture like this, when the person is going to stop this activity of walking, so the gesture of walking is going to be transformed, is a gesture of standing. It is difficult to imagine that that person will be expanding the torso when she stops the activity of walking. So we see here that the gestures involve movement, but that the coordination of these movements has to apply, yes, before you stop the gesture, the walking gesture. It's very clear here that there are different spots on the anatomical structure. Well, there are different bones. These bones are not affected by the movements in the sense that they do not change shape when the person is moving. They will remain. Yes, what is only changing is the angles between the different parts. And Alexander is pointing to the angle of the torso relatively to the hips. It's very strange that a senior teacher that has more than 20 years of training is walking like this. What was even stranger is that the teachers in the group were behaving in a very similar way. The differences were very small, in fact. All could, well, realize that yes, when they were walking with the top of the torso very far back. And in fact, the tendency was that the middle and lower part of the torso were going forward. And that is associated with the shortening of the spine. When you imagine a torso and you place the upper part of the torso further back than the middle and lower part, you have to understand that you are shortening in a convex way. It's absolutely obvious. It's not possible to imagine otherwise. So I realized that Alexander was watching people with the geometry in mind, because when you're talking about the angle between the torso and the hips, well, you're having an idea of what is the anatomical structure doing, what is the person doing with the different parts of the anatomical structure during the gesture. So that was very strange, because in the modern Alexander technique, we had this idea, this theory, that if the person was able to release the suboccipital muscles so that the head and neck could be in a new relation with the head leading and like the neck following, well, after a while, all the gestural activities would become better, would improve. That there was this idea of mythical control. If you can talk or make your pupil learn how to organize the head in relation to the rest of the neck and the neck and head to the torso, then after a while it would like flow into something that would be, well, working perfectly. Well, we have a teacher that has had 20 years of practice. She has practiced the Alexander technique and taught the Alexander technique to other people, but she has also benefited from it. She has taught herself, and she is at ease, and she looks at ease. But when you have an optical control of her movements, you find something strange, is that the person is still, in fact, guided by what she feels. She's still in the same problem that Alexander was pointing out in the problem of reeducation of sensory appreciation. So there has been no reeducation of sensory appreciation in walking. So you can imagine that when the person stops walking, of course, the same angular relationship between the parts is going to stay. There is no miracle here. If you do walk in a certain way, you cannot just stop and just give your direction and be changed by magic. So what it is we mean by coordination of movements, it's important to go deep into that, because most people have no idea what it is we mean when we use the word coordination. Most people have no idea. They think of coordination of muscles. As I've said before, it's in fact demonstrated by Nikolai Bernstein that it's impossible to coordinate muscles. The brain has that function, not our conscious mind. But your conscious mind can really deal with movements. We see that there are different spots on the anatomical structure, and it's absolutely obvious that in walking, that person is giving consent to different speeds for the different movement. In walking, for one part to arrive forward first, well, that person is giving consent to a movement with an increased speed on, for example, the foot. Most people have this idea that to walk, you have to take a step. You have to send the foot forward. That's common. Well, it's common and incorrect, according to Alexander, because if you do so, you will find that you, well, assign different speed to the different parts of the torso, And as a result of the different speed of the parts of the torso, you are clearly shortening the back. You're clearly protruding the middle part. You're clearly pulling back with the upper torso. So this is shortening the torso. And as I said before, why is it important to understand that we do shorten the torso when we guide ourselves by feeling? Is that, well, you have to, well, discuss the equilibrium at the moment of contact with the floor. At the moment of contact with the floor, the person is not supported correctly. The person is falling back. This is the main problem of equilibrium. And I'm not talking about the fact that this means that there is a restriction on breathing, that there is too much, of course, if you do bend the torso, you get different pressures inside the back. And there is an increased pressure on the abdomen. It's absolutely certain because the spine is very far forward in the middle and very far back at the top. So suddenly we understand much better that I will show you another picture to show you that it's not that I appreciate particularly the picture of Alexander walking on the sand, because it's Alexander on the right here. And but there is something absolutely clear in the way, even if I do not think that this is the absolute best way to walk forward, there is something that is very different, is that is not shortening the torso. And that means that the coordination of the movements of the parts is very different from that of a senior modern Alexander technique teacher. What we see here is that the top, middle, and bottom of the torso are in fact moved at the same speed. If they were not moved at the same speed, well, one should be in front of the other. Well, they are not. It's amazing in this picture, despite the fact that the arms are not used properly, that the legs is sent very far forward, so that is in fact shortening the whole stature in walking. It doesn't matter. He's able to in fact send the foot very far forward, but keep the expansion of the torso, which means that he's affecting the same speed to the 3 different spots, which this teacher has no idea about. She's not coordinating consciously the movements. Yes, she's trying to release the neck and have the head go forward and up. And the whole result is that what she's saying and what she's doing have no link together. There is no relationship between the orders and the activity. On the right, it's very different. It's absolutely clear that this man has the head forward and upward relative to the back, when that person has the head completely and the neck completely backward relative to the middle of the torso. Yes? So this is entering into the reality of conscious guidance and control. We do not consciously guide muscles. This man has no knowledge of the muscle. He doesn't need to. What he needs is to be able to see, first of all, what is happening at the moment of contact with the floor. He's using exactly the same system as I'm using here. Well, he did not invent anything. He's using the picture of a runner, and is showing in his first book that at the moment of contact of the foot with the floor in running, he's pointing to the fact that the top of the torso of the runner is very far back. Yes, it's exactly the same system. I didn't invent anything here, but it's not the question of inventing. It's a question of starting to connect the words we are using. So if we say we teach coordination, we have to explain that it is coordination of movements of the parts, and we can reason about the movements of the parts. We can reason that, yes, this man must be moving the different parts at the same speed. And when we enter the stage of readjustment, what are we teaching exactly in conscious guidance and control? Well, we are teaching people to, in fact, use instructions, to detail the speed of the different movements of the parts, so that by themselves they can progressively get to a result that they are not going to feel, a result that will appear only when they are filmed walking and we take a frame where they are setting the torso on the support. Is there a correct coordinated support? Alexander uses very often the coordinated support. Is there a coordinated support at the moment of contact with the floor? We can say, well, yes, with Alexander is more or less correct. It could be much better. You have to imagine a situation where the person assigned the same speed to the movement of the three parts of the torso and to the foot. And then you get into another idea, is that you see here some what we call tableau. These were drawings, diagrams that the Delsart practitioner used in order to explain to the actors how they could organize their movement on stage. So the idea was to have people organize different gestures according to what is shown here is called a type. A type is an impression, is something that is perfect, that stays. So what is the question here? The question here is to see what happens when we freeze a frame. When we freeze a frame, I realized in watching these diagrams, there are hundreds of them, of course. I started to see something, is that in fact there is a geometrical principle in these images, is that we can see that the top of the torso, that is the frontal part, that is the top of the sternum, is exactly above the front of the instep. This is a book, Mimic, Physiognomy and Jest, which was written in and translated, written in French, of course, but translated into English, I think in 1895. 1895 is just a year before Alexander started to give private lessons. So it's difficult to imagine that Alexander did not see these albums of photographs, of diagrams. So what was the point? You cannot understand what these diagrams are about by just looking at them. In order to understand what we are talking about, why is this similar to Alexander's ideas, is because you need to practice. You need to tell yourself, I am going to walk and stop in that gesture. I am going to walk and stop myself in any of these gestures as if I was an actor that has to go to a cross on the floor on stage and start to deliver a speech. When you start these procedures and you film yourself, you find that placing the foot and the top of the torso on the same vertical line is not something you can achieve by feeling. You have to start organizing your activity according to a different way. Because if you do train, if you do try to, according to feeling, you're saying to yourself, I'm going to walk to that position on stage, and when I arrive there, I will be in that stance, in that gesture. Yes? So, of course, you have to move the two spots on the stage, and each time you take a step, you can check on video whether you are or you are not on the vertical. If you trust to your feeling sense, if you appreciate where you are according to what you feel, first of all, you will discover a slight problem. You will discover that the throat and the feet are very far apart. They are like at the extremities of the organism. And there is a problem. there is a you have no feeling of where you're moving two different parts. You may have a feeling where you are with the throat, but to have a feeling of where you are with the throat, with the feet, and of course with other parts of the torso, because that is just the beginning of conscious guidance and control. You can, I showed you earlier that Alexander was clearly organizing the angle of the torso relatively to the leg, and also organizing the shape of the torso so that the frontal parts were all moving at the same speed. So I tried to go to a gesture like this. Yes, I tried to ask. I had a training course of the modern Alexander technique that was starting to become something different, and I was starting to ask students to move from one place to another, filmed, and see if they were capable of reproducing a type, what we call a conscious type. So that when they stop the movement or when they are filmed at the moment of contact with the floor, that they would be in that shape. Wow, that is a real complex procedure. At first, you can try and release your head and neck and do anything you want. You will find that orders have to be followed all the time during the gesture in order for you to stop in the correct adjustment. So we come to this idea of three different coordination, re-education. You cannot trust your feeling in order to appear on stage like this and appear natural. And last, adjustment. How do you adjust the speed of the different parts in an activity? That is the real basis of conscious guidance and control. Understanding that when we say we readjust the characteristic of movements. And movements, I say S. There is never one movement to be organized. There is never this idea that by changing, I don't know, the relation between the head and the neck, or changing the way the foot is going to be set on the floor, this is never going to be a tool that would help the person to change her own organization of the parts by herself. You cannot imagine this in the modern Alexander technique. It is possible in the initial Alexander technique, the way I teach it, it is not. It is absolutely not. So you must understand that in order to change the speed of different parts at the same time, there is a mental organization to be constructed. The person must be able to maintain in mind the different instructions. These instructions have to take into account what is happening when the person is walking habitually, according to a feeling sense. You have to understand that a person that needs to readjust in order to lengthen the torso will have to understand that she has to readjust movements, not a shape. You see, many people think shape. Oh, they defend themselves from thinking shape, of course, but they still bring people into a shape. We are not interested in shapes. We are interested in speeds. Well, all this, of course, comes from not only the Alexander technique. It's clear that other people have worked. There is we've seen the types, the Delsart types, but there is also the Delsart system, the gestural system that is very interesting. So he's saying that gesture, the gesture, you would say any gesture, is composed of movements and the movements of time. So what do we mean by movement is composed of time? It's very interesting. It's quite simple, in fact. Once you understand and you view how Delsart was proposing his system, Well, you understand that the movement is made of course, displacement, yes, in time. So displacement in time is speed. So you have to start teaching people to realize that more or less they are giving consent to certain speed, and they have to start to stop giving consent to this speed if these speeds are in fact creating a shortening of the torso. That is two things, I repeat, imbalance. The person here is fighting an antagonistic action that she has herself constructed. It's she's fighting from against the momentum of the different parts that are behind the point of contact with the floor. Yes? And at the same time, that person is creating a narrowing of the back, a constriction of the chest. It makes no sense. It makes no sense to live with such organization of the movements of the different parts. So it's very simple. I teach people to start to play with this, start to experiment. Is it possible to use an instruction to accelerate some parts? Yes. An instruction that we call of definite performance. And is it possible also to use other verbal instructions to inhibit definite movements or inhibit the speed? For example, there is an extreme speed for the foot. There is a speed that is very great also for the hip. Is it possible to ask the person to move with different speeds? What is absolutely curious is yes, it is. It is not. It is not. I mean, unthinkable at all. It's fairly simple. That raises a question. Well, I've been asking this question to myself for a long time. Is that why did not Alexander explain this? Why did he? Why keeping the technique in such a very, very strange, incomprehensible system? Because I can ask the question, because when I watch Alexander's film or when I see his picture, well, he knew all this. It's absolutely clear. I know that because in order to get the lengthening torso that he presents, I can tell you, you need to organize the movements of the different parts. You need to be very clear about what condition of speed you want for the different parts. So he knew it, and he still wanted to keep everything for himself and to appear as the magician with his hands that could organize the people. But when they were organized, they had no clue about how it was done, and no clue about how they could easily reproduce it by themselves, because all they had was the feeling that the teacher, or produced by the manipulation of the teacher. Oh, so yes, after a lesson with Alexander, they were very well organized. You could see that the torso was lengthening. But just wait 2 seconds and look how they are going to walk. Do you imagine that they are going to carry into their walking the shape? It's impossible if you don't understand the problem of the coordination of movements in time and space. So that is the fundamentals of conscious guidance and control. And in this, we are very close, in fact, to many, many passages that Alexander has written, because there are clues of this technique everywhere in his books. Unfortunately, there are also other passages that he added after 1918, in which he says that without the hands of the teacher, the pupil cannot, in fact, change his own coordination. I do think this is a lie, a blatant lie. It's like he wants to keep to himself his technique. He wants to, in fact, dominate the pupil instead of really teaching the pupil. If you do teach what you know, well, people are going to, well, accept you as a teacher, not as a messiah, not as a fantastic a genius, you know, that one in a million. No, no. Alexander was not one in a million. Alexander had, well, was sitting on the shoulder of giants, and he forgot to tell us who they were and how he constructed the system. So this is the idea behind what we call the understanding of the coordination of movements. And it's also, so because I want to go back to that first picture I was talking about, that first sentence of Alexander. Let me show you here. This is the one. You'll have to do some job to edit that. So the method of conscious guidance and control is based firstly on the understanding of the coordinated uses of the muscular mechanism. Not the muscles in themselves, but the mechanism that are producing movements and how these movements are organized together with their different speed, their different starting point, ending point, and also the idea that each and every movement can be consciously directed and controlled. What it means is that it's possible to use instructions. Alexander used this idea of new orders. I think we need to talk one day about the orders that are used in the Alexander technique. And each and every movement can be consciously directed and controlled. It's possible to give people instructions of movements. So first of all, we ask people to locate some bony parts of their torso, their abdominal, their anatomical structure. And when they understand what we are talking about something simple, a movement of a bony part in space. So if the person are filmed, and all the lessons we give are filmed, so that the person can, in fact, in retrospect, consciously control what she's done with the movements of the part. The person will see that she starts from a certain position. So the torso has a certain angle, the torso has a certain shape that is either convex or concave. And if the instructions of movement are correct, when the person stops, of course, the movements of adjustment, then we should see on screen, and the pupil should see on screen the result of his own conscious guidance of the movements. Very often, it's not exact, it's not accurate. Sometimes it even goes in the wrong direction, but it doesn't matter, because when the pupil has suddenly seen that with using certain instructions of movement, I am going to pull, for example, the top of the torso forward faster than the middle torso where the ribs are. Yes, the person starts with a very simple instruction like this, and the person will just at one moment start the movements. So the person is moving both parts, but the person is moving both parts with an idea of differential speed between the two parts. It sounds very complex. In fact, it's not. And the person will just, well, in 2 seconds, create the two movements at the same time, stop the two movements at the same time, and then we look at the film. Is the new organization of the part more accurate according to the instruction that we are given or not? Is the new organization of the part closer to an expansion of the torso? Then we say this is going in the right direction. Or is, for example, let's say that 2 cases may happen. One movement was not enough, so the person is still in the old configuration, Or maybe the person has gone too far, because you have to understand also that movements in space can, well, there is no limit. You can go too far. And if you go too far, you go past the middle way. And if you go past the middle way, well, it should appear on screen. You should see it. And if you do see it, then you have to think, okay, I based the movement on the ideas I had, the previous experiences I made, and the result is not in the right direction. And the person will just, well, start the procedure all over again. There is no problem with mistakes. There is no problem with errors, because in fact, errors are always used in order to create a new experiment. I've heard people say, yes, but then you need a video all the time. In fact, not. Absolutely not. It's not the way it works. The way it works is that after watching yourself a few times, you start to approximate the accurate coordination of speeds of the different parts. It's something very strange. It's not a feeling. It's like a reasoning realization. And you start to become very, very accurate, so that you look, in fact, in a state of expansion. Even if you move your torso in different ways, you are always, well, monitoring accurately, which is the control. You give control to somebody, they will become able to organize themselves in any conditions, in any activities. That is the gift of conscious guidance and control.